What if the person you love is the one you're supposed to hate? In 1855 Transylvania, a celebrated duke and the daughter of his enemy share a secret that could change everything. As war brews and loyalties are tested, their forbidden romance hangs in the balance. Will they choose duty or follow their hearts? Stick around to find out. And don't forget to comment below with where you're tuning in from and what keeps you coming back to our channel. The harsh winter of 1855 gripped Transylvania with its icy claws, painting the landscape in a stark palette of white and gray. Snow-laden forests stretched as far as the eye could see, their silent beauty punctuated only by the distant, haunting howls of wolves. Through this frigid tableau rode Duke Alexandru Vlaicu, a commanding figure atop his noble steed. At 38 years old, the Duke cut an imposing figure, his broad shoulders draped in a black cloak that billowed behind him like a shadow given form. Alexandru's piercing blue eyes scanned the treacherous path ahead, ever vigilant. He was returning from a routine patrol of his lands, his mind occupied with thoughts of the growing unrest that threatened the fragile peace of his beloved Transylvania. The weight of duty sat heavily upon his shoulders, a burden he had borne since ascending to his title. As he guided his horse through a particularly dense stretch of forest, the stillness was suddenly shattered by a desperate cry. Alexandru's body tensed, his warrior's instincts immediately on alert. Without hesitation, he spurred his horse forward, following the sound of distress. As he burst into a small clearing, the scene before him unfolded like a nightmarish tableau. A woman, her dark hair whipping wildly in the wind, was trapped against the gnarled trunk of an ancient oak. Her cloak, once fine but now tattered, was snagged on the tree's twisted branches, leaving her helpless before the advancing pack of hungry wolves. The woman's green eyes, wide with fear, met Alexandru's gaze. In that fleeting moment, something indefinable passed between them, a spark of recognition perhaps, or the first trembling notes of a song yet unsung. But there was no time for contemplation. The wolves, emboldened by hunger, were closing in. Alexandru leapt from his horse, drawing his sword in one fluid motion. "Stay behind me!" he shouted to the woman, his voice carrying over the snarls of the wolves. "I'll hold them off while you free yourself." With a ferocious cry, he swung at the nearest wolf, the sharp edge of his weapon slicing through the air with deadly precision. The pack, startled by this new threat, hesitated. Alexandru pressed his advantage, his movements a blur of controlled violence as he drove the wolves back. Soon the injured wolves retreated, their howls of pain mingling with snarls of frustration as they slunk back into the shadows of the forest. Panting slightly from the exertion, Alexandru turned to the woman. She had managed to free herself from the branches and now stood trembling, her eyes fixed upon her savior with a mixture of awe and gratitude. "Are you hurt, my lady?" Alexandru asked, his voice gentle despite its natural depth. "No, thanks to you," she replied, her voice melodious even when shaken. "I owe you my life, sir. May I know the name of my rescuer?" Alexandru hesitated for a moment. "Alexandru," he said finally, omitting his title. "And you, my lady?" "Elena," she answered, a small smile gracing her lips. "I am in your debt, Alexandru. Your bravery is remarkable. I've never seen anyone face down a pack of wolves with such courage." Alexandru felt a warmth spread through his chest at her words. "I'm just glad I was here to help," he said, trying to downplay his actions. "But what brings you out here alone, Elena? These woods are dangerous, especially in winter." Elena's face clouded for a moment. "I was gathering herbs," she said, gesturing to a small basket that lay forgotten in the snow. "My father is ill, and I hope to find some remedies in the forest. I know it was foolish to come alone, but I felt I had no choice." Alexandru's brow furrowed in concern. "Your father's illness must be serious indeed for you to risk such danger," he said softly. "Is there no physician who can help?" Elena shook her head, her eyes downcast. "We've tried, but his condition is complicated. Traditional medicine has failed us, so I thought perhaps nature might provide what doctors cannot." Alexandru felt a surge of admiration for this woman's dedication to her family. "Your devotion is commendable," he said. "But please allow me to escort you home. The wolves may return, and I would not see you in danger again." Elena hesitated, her gaze darting towards the path from which she had come. "That's very kind of you, Alexandru, but I wouldn't want to impose. You've already done so much." "I insist," Alexandru said firmly, but with a gentle smile. "It would ease my mind to know you've returned safely. Besides, these woods can be treacherous to navigate alone, especially as the day grows late." Elena studied him for a long moment, her green eyes seeming to peer into his very soul. Finally she nodded. "Very well," she said. "I accept your offer with gratitude." Alexandru helped Elena onto his horse, then mounted behind her. As they set off through the forest, he couldn't help but be acutely aware of her presence. The warmth of her body against his chest, the scent of lavender that clung to her hair. As they rode, they talked, their conversation flowing easily despite their recent acquaintance. Elena spoke of her love for the Transylvanian countryside, its wild beauty and rich history. Alexandru found himself captivated by her passion and knowledge. "You speak as though you've studied our history extensively," Alexandru remarked, impressed. Elena laughed softly, the sound like music to his ears. "I suppose you could say I have," she replied. "My father, he's always emphasized the importance of knowing one's heritage. He believes that to shape the future, we must understand the past." There was something in her tone, a hint of sadness or perhaps regret, that made Alexandru curious. But before he could inquire further, Elena pointed ahead. "There," she said. "That's my village, just beyond those trees." As they emerged from the forest, Alexandru saw a small cluster of houses nestled in a valley. Elena directed him to a modest cottage on the outskirts of the village. As they dismounted, Alexandru couldn't help but feel a twinge of reluctance. Their time together had been brief, but he found himself wishing it could last longer. "Thank you again, Alexandru," Elena said, turning to face him. "I don't know how I can ever repay your kindness." Alexandru shook his head. "There's no need for repayment. Your safety is reward enough." He paused, then added, "Though perhaps we might meet again. I would love to hear more about your studies of Transylvanian history." A blush crept across Elena's cheeks, visible even in the fading light. I would like that," she said softly. "There's a festival in the village square next week. Perhaps, if you're not too busy." "I'll be there," Alexandru said quickly, perhaps too eagerly. He cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. "That is, I would be honored to attend." Elena smiled, a radiant expression that made Alexandru's heart skip a beat. "Until then," she said, giving him a small curtsy before turning towards her home. As Alexandru mounted his horse and began the journey back to his castle, his mind was awhirl with thoughts of Elena. He knew he should be focused on the matters of state that awaited him, the reports of unrest and the strategies he needed to devise. But for now, those concerns seemed distant, overshadowed by the memory of green eyes and a voice that echoed in his mind like a half-remembered dream. Little did he know that this chance encounter would set in motion events that would change not only his life, but the fate of all Transylvania. As he rode, the wind carried whispers of rebel activity, a reminder of the storm brewing on the horizon. But for Alexandru, in this moment, the future held a glimmer of something he hadn't dared hope for in years. The promise of love, and with it, the possibility of healing the wounds that duty and loneliness had carved into his heart. The towering stone walls of Castle Vlaicu stood sentinel against the fading winter light, its imposing silhouette a testament to centuries of Transylvanian history. As Duke Alexandru Vlaicu rode through the gates, the warmth of his encounter with Elena still lingered, a stark contrast to the chill that seemed to permeate the very stones of his ancestral home. Dismounting with practiced ease, Alexandru handed the reins to a waiting stable boy. "Take good care of him," he instructed, patting his horse's neck. "He served me well today." As he strode towards the main keep, Alexandru's mind raced with thoughts of the mysterious woman he had rescued. Her green eyes, filled with both fear and fierce determination, haunted him. But duty called, and he knew he couldn't afford to be distracted. "Your Grace!" a voice called out, interrupting his reverie. Alexandru turned to see his most trusted advisor, Mihai, hurrying towards him. The older man's face was creased with worry, his gray hair disheveled as if he'd been running his hands through it in agitation. "Mihai," Alexandru greeted him, noting the tension in his advisor's posture. "What news?" Mihai fell into step beside him as they entered the castle. "Troubling reports from the eastern borders, Your Grace. The rebel activity has increased. There are whispers of a planned uprising." Alexandru's jaw tightened. He had hoped for more time to address the growing unrest peacefully. "Tell me everything," he commanded as they made their way to his private study. Once inside the warmth of the room, with its rich tapestries and crackling fireplace, Alexandru poured 2 glasses of wine. He handed one to Mihai, who accepted it gratefully. "Our spies report that the rebel leader, a man known only as the Wolf, has been rallying support in the rural villages," Mihai began, his voice low. "He speaks of injustices, of land stolen by the nobility. His words are finding fertile ground among the poor and disenfranchised." Alexandru sipped his wine, his brow furrowed in thought. "And what of his true identity? Have we learned anything more?" Mihai shook his head. "Nothing concrete, Your Grace. He's careful, never showing his face in public. But there are rumors." He hesitated, as if unsure whether to continue. "Speak freely, old friend," Alexandru encouraged him. "Some say he's a nobleman himself, one who turned his back on his own class out of guilt or a misguided sense of justice," Mihai said. "Others claim he's a common man blessed with uncommon charisma and intelligence. The truth, I fear, remains elusive." Alexandru moved to the window, gazing out at the snow-covered landscape. His mind drifted briefly to Elena, wondering if she had heard these whispers of rebellion in her village. He pushed the thought aside, focusing on the matter at hand. "We cannot allow this unrest to grow," he said firmly. "But neither can we ignore the grievances of our people. There must be a way to address their concerns without resorting to violence." Mihai's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Your Grace, forgive me, but your father would have—" "I am not my father," Alexandru cut him off, his voice sharp. He softened his tone as he continued. "The old ways of ruling through fear and force alone are no longer sufficient. We must find a new path." A moment of silence stretched between them, filled only by the crackling of the fire. Finally, Mihai spoke, his voice careful. "What do you propose, Your Grace?" Alexandru turned back to face his advisor, his blue eyes alight with determination. "I want to meet with village leaders from across Transylvania, not just the wealthy landowners, but representatives from all walks of life. We need to hear their grievances directly, to understand what drives them to consider rebellion." Mihai's expression was a mixture of concern and admiration. "It's a bold move, Your Grace. Some might see it as a sign of weakness, and others might see it as a sign of strength and wisdom," Alexandru countered. "A ruler who listens to his people is not weak, Mihai. He is enlightened." As he spoke, Alexandru couldn't help but think of Elena again. Her passion for Transylvanian history, her dedication to her family. These were the qualities he wanted to nurture in his people. Perhaps, he mused, their chance encounter had been more than just a rescue. Perhaps it was a sign, pointing him towards a new way of governing. "Very well, Your Grace," Mihai said, bowing slightly. "I'll begin making arrangements for these meetings, but I must urge caution. The rebels may see this as an opportunity to strike." Alexandru nodded, acknowledging the risk. "We'll take precautions, of course, but this is a chance we must take. The future of Transylvania depends on it." As Mihai left to carry out his instructions, Alexandru found himself alone with his thoughts. He moved to his desk, where a map of Transylvania lay spread out. His fingers traced the familiar contours of mountains and valleys, coming to rest on the area where he had met Elena. A sudden realization struck him. The village festival she had mentioned. It could be the perfect opportunity to begin his outreach. He could attend in secret, listen to the people's concerns without the formality of his title getting in the way. And if he happened to see Elena again, well, that would be a welcome bonus. With renewed energy, Alexandru began to formulate his plan. He would need to travel in disguise, perhaps as a merchant or a scholar. He'd need to choose trusted guards who could blend in with the crowd. And he'd need to be prepared for anything, from hostile villagers to potential rebel spies. As night fell over Castle Vlaicu, Alexandru found himself filled with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. The path ahead was fraught with danger, both from those who opposed change and from those who sought to overthrow the existing order entirely. But for the first time in a long while, he felt hope. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new strategies to devise. But tonight, as he prepared for bed, Alexandru allowed himself to dwell on softer thoughts. The memory of Elena's smile, the sound of her laughter, the warmth of her body against his as they rode through the forest, these images danced in his mind, a counterpoint to the weighty matters of state. As sleep finally claimed him, Alexandru's dreams were a tapestry of possibilities. A Transylvania at peace, prosperous and united, and at the center of it all, a pair of green eyes that seemed to hold the key to a future he had only just begun to imagine. The village square bustled with activity as the annual harvest festival got underway. Colorful banners fluttered in the crisp autumn breeze, and the air was filled with the enticing aroma of freshly baked bread and roasting meats. Laughter and music intertwined, creating a tapestry of sound that echoed off the surrounding buildings. Among the revelers, a man in simple merchant's garb made his way through the crowd. His beard was neatly trimmed, and a wide-brimmed hat obscured much of his face. Few would have recognized him as Duke Alexandru Vlaicu, the powerful nobleman who ruled these lands. But beneath his disguise, Alexandru's keen blue eyes missed nothing as he observed the festivities. As he navigated the throng, Alexandru's thoughts drifted to Elena. Would she be here? Would she recognize him in this disguise? The memory of their encounter in the forest still burned bright in his mind, and he found himself scanning the faces around him, hoping to catch a glimpse of her emerald eyes. "Fresh bread. Get your fresh bread here," a nearby vendor called out, momentarily distracting Alexandru from his search. He approached the stall, deciding that engaging with the locals might yield valuable insights. "Good day, sir," Alexandru greeted the baker, adopting the accent of a traveling merchant. "That bread smells delicious. Tell me, how has the harvest been this year?" The baker, a portly man with flour dusting his apron, beamed at the compliment. "Ah, it's been a good year, thank the heavens. But times are still hard for many. The taxes, you know." He lowered his voice conspiratorially. "Some say the Duke is too harsh, but I think he's just poorly advised. If only he knew how his people struggled." Alexandru felt a pang of guilt at the baker's words. He opened his mouth to respond when a familiar voice caught his attention. "2 loaves, please, Mircea," Elena said, approaching the stall. "And some of those sweet rolls for my father." Alexandru's heart skipped a beat. She was even more beautiful than he remembered, her dark hair adorned with autumn flowers, her green eyes sparkling in the sunlight. She noticed him staring and offered a polite smile. "Good day, sir," she greeted him. "Are you new to our village? I don't believe I've seen you before." Alexandru scrambled to compose himself. "Yes, just passing through. I'm a merchant from the north. Alexandru," he added, using his real name on impulse. Elena's eyes widened slightly at the name, a flicker of recognition passing across her face. "Alexandru, that's an interesting coincidence. I met someone by that name not long ago. A rather heroic encounter, actually." The baker, Mircea, leaned in, intrigued. "Oh? Do tell, Elena. We could use some excitement around here." Elena hesitated, glancing at Alexandru. "Well, I was gathering herbs in the forest when I was set upon by wolves. This Alexandru, he came out of nowhere and fought them off. Saved my life, truth be told." Mircea whistled, impressed. "Sounds like quite the hero. Was he a soldier? A nobleman, perhaps?" I'm not sure," Elena admitted. "He never said, but he was brave and kind." She turned to Alexandru, a questioning look in her eyes. "Perhaps you know of him? Another Alexandru from the north?" Alexandru felt trapped between truth and necessity. "I've heard tales of brave men in these parts," he said carefully. "But I'm just a simple merchant, I'm afraid. No heroics for me." Elena studied him for a moment longer, then nodded, seemingly accepting his words. "Well, it's a pleasure to meet you, Alexandru the merchant. I hope you enjoy our festival. If you'll excuse me, I should get these back to my father." As she turned to leave, Alexandru felt a surge of panic. He couldn't let her slip away again. "Wait," he called out. I'm new here, as I said. Perhaps you could show me around? If you're not too busy, of course." Elena paused, considering. "I suppose I could spare a few moments," she said with a small smile. "Follow me. I'll give you a tour of our humble village." As they walked away from the bakery stall, Mircea called out after them, "You two enjoy yourselves. And Elena, don't forget to tell your father about the meeting tonight. Important matters to discuss, you know." Alexandru's ears perked up at this, but he kept his expression neutral as Elena led him through the festival. She pointed out various stalls and attractions, her knowledge of local history and customs impressive. Alexandru found himself captivated not just by the information, but by the passion with which she spoke. "You seem to know a great deal about this place," he remarked as they paused near a group of musicians. "Have you lived here all your life?" Elena's smile faltered slightly. "Most of it, yes. My father, he moved us here when I was young. Said it was important to be close to the people, to understand their struggles." Alexandru sensed there was more to the story, but he didn't press. Instead, he gestured to the dancers twirling nearby. "Would you care to join them?" he asked, offering his hand. Elena hesitated for a moment, then took his hand with a shy smile. "Why not? It's a festival, after all." As they joined the dance, Alexandru felt a rush of exhilaration. The music swelled around them, and for a few precious moments, he forgot about the weight of his responsibilities, the looming threat of rebellion. Here, in this moment, he was simply a man dancing with a beautiful woman. But reality intruded all too soon. As the dance ended, Alexandru noticed a group of men gathering near the edge of the square, speaking in hushed tones. Among them was a tall, imposing figure whose very presence seemed to command respect. Elena followed his gaze and stiffened slightly. "That's my father," she said quietly. "And some of the village elders. They've been meeting more often lately, discussing, well, I'm not entirely sure, but there's been talk of change, of standing up to injustice." Alexandru felt a chill run down his spine. Could this be the rebel leader his advisors had warned him about? And if so, what did that make Elena? An innocent caught in the middle, or a willing participant in the brewing rebellion? "Thank you for the dance and the tour," he said, forcing a smile. "I should be going. I have some business to attend to before nightfall." Elena nodded, though she looked slightly disappointed. "Of course. It was a pleasure meeting you, Alexandru. I hope you found our village welcoming." As Alexandru made his way back through the crowd, his mind raced with the implications of what he'd seen and heard. The festival had provided valuable insights, but it had also raised new questions. One thing was certain. The situation in Transylvania was even more complex than he had realized. He needed to get back to the castle, to confer with his advisors. But as he slipped away from the festivities, Alexandru couldn't shake the memory of Elena in his arms, the warmth of her smile, the intelligence in her eyes. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew that their paths would cross again, and when they did, he would have to decide where his true loyalties lay, with his duty as a ruler or with the stirrings of his heart. The crisp autumn air carried a hint of wood smoke as Elena made her way through the winding streets of the village. The festival's joyous sounds faded behind her, replaced by the soft crunch of leaves beneath her feet. Her mind was awash with conflicting emotions, the lingering warmth from her dance with the mysterious merchant Alexandru, and the growing unease about the meeting her father was attending. As she approached her modest home on the outskirts of the village, Elena paused, her hand resting on the weathered wooden gate. The windows glowed with soft candlelight, and she could hear muffled voices from within. Taking a deep breath to steel herself, she pushed open the gate and entered. The main room was crowded with men, their faces etched with worry and determination. At the center stood her father, Radu Lupescu, his tall frame commanding attention even in this gathering of village elders. As Elena entered, the conversation abruptly ceased, and all eyes turned to her. "Elena," her father said, his deep voice tinged with surprise. I thought you'd be at the festival longer. She held up the basket of bread. I brought provisions, as you asked, and some sweet rolls. I thought you might need something to keep your strength up during your discussions. A few of the men chuckled, the tension in the room easing slightly. Radu's expression softened, and he beckoned her closer. Always thinking of others, my dear. Come, join us for a moment. You're old enough now to understand what's at stake. Elena set the basket down and moved to stand beside her father, acutely aware of the curious glances from the other men. She recognized most of them, farmers, craftsmen, respected members of the community. But there were a few faces she didn't know, their clothing suggesting they had come from other villages. We were just discussing the Duke's latest proclamation. One of the elders, a grizzled farmer named Vasile, spoke up. Increased taxes to fund his improvements to the region, as if we haven't been improving our own lands for generations. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Elena felt a pang of uncertainty, remembering the kindness of the Duke who had saved her in the forest. Could he truly be as callous as these men believed? It's not just the taxes, another man added, his voice low and urgent. There are rumors that he's planning to seize more land for his own use, land that's been in our families for centuries. Radu held up a hand, silencing the growing chorus of complaints. This is why we must act now, before it's too late. The Duke may have his soldiers, but we have something far more powerful, the will of the people. Elena couldn't stay silent any longer. Father, she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart, are you truly proposing rebellion? Against the Duke's entire army? The room fell silent, all eyes on Radu. He turned to his daughter, his expression a mixture of pride and sorrow. Not rebellion, Elena. Revolution. A chance to build a Transylvania where all people have a voice, not just the nobility. But at what cost? Elena pressed, emboldened by the gravity of the moment. How many lives would be lost in such a conflict? Surely there must be another way. A way to make our grievances heard without resorting to violence. One of the unknown men scoffed. Naive words from a girl who knows nothing of the world. The Duke and his kind only understand one language. Force. Radu's eyes flashed dangerously. Watch your tongue, Mircea. My daughter may be young, but she has a wisdom that surpasses many men twice her age. He turned back to Elena, his voice softening. Your concern is valid, my dear. We do not wish for bloodshed, but we must be prepared for all possibilities. Elena's mind raced, thinking of the disguised Duke she had danced with just hours ago. If only these men could see him as she had, not as a distant tyrant, but as a man capable of kindness and understanding. What if, she began hesitantly, what if we could arrange a meeting with the Duke, present our grievances directly without the filter of his advisors? The room erupted in a mixture of laughter and outrage. Meet with the Duke? Vasile exclaimed. Girl, do you think he would deign to speak with simple villagers like us? But Radu was stroking his beard thoughtfully. It's not as far-fetched as it sounds, he mused. The Duke is young, new to his position. He may be more open to dialogue than his predecessors. And how do you propose we arrange such a meeting? Another elder asked skeptically. Elena's heart pounded as she realized this was her moment to bridge the gap between two worlds. I may have a way, she said, thinking quickly. There's a merchant in the village, a newcomer. He seems well connected. Perhaps he could help us get a message to the Duke. Radu studied his daughter intently, as if seeing her in a new light. This merchant, do you trust him? Elena thought of Alexandru's kind eyes, the way he had listened intently as she spoke of the village's history. I believe he is a good man, she said carefully, and if nothing else, he is an outsider. He has no stake in our local politics. After a moment of tense silence, Radu nodded. Very well. Elena, you will approach this merchant tomorrow. See if he can help us arrange a meeting. But be cautious. We cannot risk word of our plans reaching the wrong ears. As the meeting dispersed, Elena felt a mix of relief and apprehension. She had bought time, potentially prevented an immediate rush to violence. But now the burden of bridging this divide rested squarely on her shoulders. Later that night, as she lay in bed, Elena's mind whirled with the events of the day. The festival, the dance with Alexandru, the tense meeting in her home. It all seemed like a dream. But as she drifted off to sleep, one image remained clear in her mind. The Duke's blue eyes, filled with warmth and understanding as he saved her from the wolves. Little did she know that at that very moment, in the grand castle miles away, those same blue eyes were open, their owner lost in thoughts of a green-eyed village girl who had captured his heart and potentially held the key to saving his realm from the brink of chaos. As dawn broke over the Transylvanian countryside, both Elena and Alexandru prepared for a day that would set in motion events that would change their lives and the fate of their beloved homeland forever. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone streets as Elena made her way through the village, her heart pounding with anticipation. She had risen early, determined to find Alexandru before he left town. The weight of her mission pressed heavily upon her shoulders. The fate of her people, perhaps even of Transylvania itself, could hinge on this conversation. As she rounded a corner, she spotted him emerging from the local inn, his merchant's attire slightly rumpled from sleep. "Alexandru," she called out, quickening her pace. He turned, surprise and pleasure lighting up his features. "Elena," he greeted her warmly. "I hadn't expected to see you again so soon." She took a deep breath, steeling herself. "I need to speak with you," she said quietly. "It's important. Is there somewhere we can talk privately?" Alexandru nodded, his expression growing serious. "Of course. There's a small grove just outside the village. We can speak there without fear of being overheard." As they walked, Elena could feel the tension radiating from Alexandru. She wondered, not for the first time, if there was more to this merchant than met the eye. The way he carried himself, the sharp intelligence in his gaze, it all spoke of a man accustomed to power and responsibility. Once they reached the grove, Alexandru turned to her, his blue eyes searching her face. "What's troubling you, Elena? You seem burdened." Elena hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Alexandru, you said you're well-traveled, that you have connections in high places. I need to ask a great favor of you." "Go on," he encouraged gently. "There's unrest in our village. In many villages across Transylvania," she began. "The people are angry, frustrated with high taxes and what they see as unjust treatment from the nobility. Some are even talking of rebellion." Alexandru's face remained impassive, but Elena noticed his hands clench slightly at his sides. "And what do you think of this talk of rebellion?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. Elena met his gaze squarely. "I think it would be a disaster. So much bloodshed, so much suffering, and for what? There must be a better way." Relief flickered across Alexandru's features, so briefly Elena almost missed it. "What did you have in mind?" "A meeting," Elena said, her voice gaining strength. "Between representatives of the villages and the Duke himself. A chance for our grievances to be heard directly, without intermediaries who might twist the message." Alexandru was silent for a long moment, his brow furrowed in thought. "And you want me to help arrange this meeting?" he finally asked. Elena nodded. "You're an outsider, someone who can move between worlds. If you could get a message to the Duke, explain the situation." "It's a dangerous game you're playing, Elena," Alexandru warned. "If the wrong people were to learn of this—" "I know the risks," she said firmly, "but the alternative is worse. Please, Alexandru, will you help us?" He studied her face intently, as if searching for something. Whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him. "Very well," he said softly. "I'll do what I can. But Elena, you must promise me something." "Anything," she replied without hesitation. "If this meeting is arranged, you must be there. The Duke will need someone who truly understands both sides, someone who can bridge the gap between nobility and common folk." Elena's eyes widened in surprise. "Me? But I'm just a village girl. What could I possibly offer in such a meeting?" Alexandru's gaze softened. "You offer wisdom, compassion, and a love for Transylvania that transcends class barriers. Trust me, Elena, Your voice will be crucial." She felt a blush creeping up her cheeks at his words. I'll do my best," she promised. As they made their way back to the village, Alexandru spoke again. "It may take some time to arrange this meeting. In the meantime, try to keep the peace here. Urge patience among those who call for immediate action." Elena nodded solemnly. "I will. And Alexandru, thank you. You may well be saving many lives with this." He smiled, a hint of sadness in his eyes. "Let us hope so, Elena, for all our sakes." As they parted ways at the village square, Elena felt a mixture of hope and trepidation. She had set something in motion, something that could change the course of Transylvanian history. But as she watched Alexandru's retreating figure, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this merchant than he was letting on. Little did she know that at that very moment, Alexandru was wrestling with his own inner turmoil. As he made his way out of the village, his mind raced with the implications of what he had just agreed to do. He had come here in disguise, hoping to gather information to understand the root of the unrest plaguing his realm. Instead, he found himself entangled in a web of intrigue and emotion far more complex than he had anticipated. The sun was high in the sky by the time Alexandru reached the secluded spot where he had left his horse and his true identity. As he changed back into the finery befitting a duke, he couldn't stop thinking about Elena. Her passion, her intelligence, her unwavering belief in the possibility of peace, all of it had touched him deeply. But now he faced an impossible dilemma. How could he arrange this meeting without revealing that he had deceived Elena and the villagers? And if the truth came out, would it destroy any chance of reconciliation between the nobility and the common people? As he mounted his horse and began the journey back to his castle, Alexandru made a decision. He would find a way to make this meeting happen, not just for the sake of Transylvania, but for Elena. Somehow he would bridge the gap between his two worlds, and in doing so, perhaps he could finally bridge the gap in his own heart. The road ahead would be fraught with danger and difficult choices, but as Alexandru urged his horse forward, he felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them. For his people, for Transylvania, and for the green-eyed village girl who had unwittingly captured the heart of a duke. The great hall of Castle Vlaicu echoed with heated voices as Duke Alexandru stood before his assembled advisors. The ornate tapestries adorning the stone walls seemed to absorb the tension in the air, their faded battle scenes a stark reminder of Transylvania's tumultuous history. "Your Grace, with all due respect, this is madness," Lord Dragos, a portly nobleman with a carefully trimmed beard, exclaimed. "Meeting with these rabble-rousers? It will only embolden them." Alexandru's steely gaze swept across the room, silencing the murmurs of agreement. "And what would you have me do, Lord Dragos? Ignore the growing unrest until it erupts into open rebellion?" Mihai, Alexandru's trusted advisor, stepped forward. "Your Grace, while I understand your desire for peace, we must consider the risks. If word of this meeting spreads, other villages might see it as a sign of weakness." Alexandru paced before the great fireplace, its dancing flames casting flickering shadows across his face. "And if we do nothing, we risk losing everything. No, gentlemen, the time for half measures has passed. We must address the root of this discontent before it's too late." Lady Ilona, one of the few women among the advisors and known for her sharp political acumen, spoke up. "Perhaps there's a middle ground, Your Grace. What if we were to send representatives to meet with the village leaders first? It would allow us to gauge their true intentions without risking your safety." Alexandru shook his head, a wry smile playing at his lips. "A sound suggestion, Lady Ilona, but I fear it would not suffice. These people need to see that their duke is willing to listen, to engage with them directly. Anything less will be seen as another noble ploy to maintain the status quo." "But surely, Your Grace," another advisor interjected, "you don't intend to go alone. The danger would be—" "Immense, yes," Alexandru finished for him, "which is why I won't be going alone. I'll take a small contingent of guards, disguised as merchants and travelers, and—" He paused, knowing his next words would spark controversy. "I intend to bring one of the villagers with me." The room erupted in shocked exclamations and protests. Alexandru raised his hand, calling for silence. Her name is Elena, he continued, once the clamor had died down. She's intelligent, compassionate, and understands both our world and theirs. Her presence will be crucial in bridging the gap between nobility and common folk. Lord Dragos sputtered in indignation. A peasant girl? In these hallowed halls? Your Grace, surely you cannot be serious. Alexandru's eyes flashed dangerously. I have never been more serious, Lord Dragos. Elena has shown wisdom beyond her years and a deep love for Transylvania. Her voice will be invaluable in these negotiations. Mihai, ever the voice of reason, stepped closer to Alexandru. Your Grace, while I admire your conviction, we must consider the practicalities. How do you propose to bring this girl here without raising suspicions? And what of her family? Surely they will notice her absence. Alexandru nodded, acknowledging the valid concerns. I've given this much thought, Mihai. We'll send a formal invitation to the village, requesting Elena's presence as a cultural ambassador. It will provide a plausible reason for her to come to the castle without arousing undue suspicion. Lady Elena raised an eyebrow. A clever ruse, Your Grace. But what of the girl herself? Does she know of your true identity? Alexandru's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. No, she does not. And for now, it must remain that way. When she arrives, I will reveal myself and explain the situation. It's a risk, I know, but one I believe is necessary. The room fell silent as the advisors digested this information. Finally, Mihai spoke, his voice soft but firm. Your Grace, I've served you and your father before you for many years. I've never known you to act rashly or without careful consideration. If you believe this is the best course of action, then you have my full support. One by one, the other advisors nodded their assent, some more reluctantly than others. Even Lord Dragos, still red-faced with indignation, gave a curt nod. Very well, Alexandru said, his voice ringing with authority. Let us make the necessary preparations. Mihai, I want you to personally oversee the security arrangements. Lady Ilona, draft the invitation to the village. Make it formal enough to be taken seriously, but not so grandiose as to raise suspicions. As the advisors filed out of the hall, each tasked with their own responsibilities, Alexandru remained by the fireplace. Mihai lingered, studying his duke with concern. There's something you're not telling us, isn't there? The old advisor asked quietly. Alexandru turned to face him, conflict evident in his blue eyes. You know me too well, old friend. Yes, there is more to this situation, and to Elena, than I've revealed. But I ask you to trust me, Mihai. What I do for the good of Transylvania. Mihai placed a comforting hand on Alexandru's shoulder. I've never doubted that, Your Grace. But be careful. The heart can be a treacherous guide in matters of state. As Mihai left, Alexandru stared into the flames, lost in thought. The memory of Elena's smile, the warmth in her green eyes, filled his mind. He knew he was taking an enormous risk, both politically and personally. But deep in his heart, he believed it was the only way forward. Outside the castle walls, the sun was setting, painting the Transylvanian sky in hues of orange and purple. In a small village miles away, Elena was helping her father prepare the evening meal, unaware that her life was about to change forever. And somewhere in between, the fate of a nation hung in the balance, awaiting the outcome of a meeting that would bring together two worlds long divided. As night fell over Transylvania, both Alexandru and Elena found themselves looking up at the same stars, each wondering what the future might hold. Little did they know that their paths were about to converge in ways neither could have imagined, setting in motion events that would reshape the very fabric of their society. The grand ballroom of Castle Vlaicu buzzed with nervous energy as nobles and village representatives alike gathered for the unprecedented meeting. Ornate chandeliers cast a warm glow over the assemblage, their light reflecting off polished armor and simple homespun alike. At one end of the room, Duke Alexandru stood tall, his regal bearing unmistakable even to those who had never laid eyes on him before. Elena, standing among the village delegation, felt her heart racing. She had barely had time to process the shock of discovering Alexandru's true identity before being thrust into this pivotal moment. Her eyes kept darting between the Duke and her father, Radu. who stood at the forefront of the village representatives, his face a mask of stern determination. Alexandru raised his hand, and a hush fell over the room. "I thank you all for coming," he began, his voice carrying easily to every corner. "We stand at a crossroads in Transylvania's history. The path we choose today will shape the future of our beloved land for generations to come." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the assembled crowd before landing on Elena. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and Elena felt a jolt of electricity run through her. "I have heard your grievances," Alexandru continued, addressing the village representatives directly. "The burden of heavy taxes, the fear of losing ancestral lands, the feeling that your voices go unheard. I stand before you now, not just as your duke, but as a man who wishes to bridge the divide that has grown between nobility and common folk." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Radu stepped forward, his voice clear and strong. "Fine words, Your Grace, but words alone will not feed our families or protect our homes. What assurances can you offer that this is not merely another empty promise?" A tense silence fell over the room. Elena held her breath, acutely aware of the precarious balance upon which everything now rested. Alexandru nodded solemnly. "A fair question, and one I intend to answer with action, not just words." He gestured to a nearby table laden with documents. "I have here a proposal for sweeping reforms, a reduction in taxes for the poorest among us, protections for ancestral lands, and the establishment of a council that will include representatives from every village in Transylvania." Gasps and exclamations erupted from both sides of the room. Lord Dragos, red-faced with indignation, burst out, "Your Grace, this is madness. You cannot simply upend centuries of tradition." "Silence!" Alexandru's voice cracked like a whip. "The time for clinging to outdated traditions at the expense of our people is over. We must evolve or face ruin." Elena, emboldened by Alexandru's words, stepped forward. "If I may speak, Your Grace." At his nod she continued, addressing both nobles and villagers. "I have seen both sides of this divide. I have felt the struggles of village life and witnessed the weight of responsibility that comes with ruling. What His Grace proposes is not the end of nobility, but the beginning of a new era where all Transylvanians have a voice." Her words seemed to resonate with many in the room, but tensions remained high. Radu regarded his daughter with a mixture of pride and concern before turning back to Alexandru. "These reforms sound promising, Your Grace, but how can we trust that they will be implemented fairly?" Alexandru's eyes met Elena's for a brief moment before he answered, "Trust must be earned, and I intend to do just that. I propose a trial period of 1 year. During this time, the reforms will be put into place under the supervision of a joint committee of nobles and village representatives. At the end of the year, we will reconvene to assess the results and make any necessary adjustments." The room buzzed with conversation as both sides considered the proposal. Lady Ilona stepped forward, her voice measured. "Your Grace, while I applaud your intentions, we must consider the practical implications. How will these reforms be funded? And what of those among the nobility who may resist these changes?" Alexandru nodded, acknowledging the valid concerns. "The initial costs will be covered by a reduction in military spending and a voluntary contribution from my personal estates. As for resistance," his gaze hardened, "those who would put their own interests above the welfare of Transylvania will find they have no place in our new order." The discussions continued for hours, with both sides raising concerns, offering suggestions, and gradually working towards a compromise. Elena found herself acting as a mediator, her unique perspective allowing her to bridge the gap between the two factions. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the high windows of the ballroom, Alexandru called for attention once more. "We have made significant progress today, but there is still much work to be done. I propose we adjourn for now and reconvene tomorrow morning to finalize the details of our agreement." There were nods of assent from around the room. As the gathering began to disperse, Alexandru approached Elena and her father. "I would be honored if you would join me for dinner this evening," he said. "There is much I believe we could learn from each other." Radu hesitated, suspicion still evident in his eyes, but Elena placed a gentle hand on his arm. "I think we should accept, Father. This is an opportunity to ensure our voices are truly heard." After a moment's consideration, Radu nodded. "Very well, Your Grace. We accept your invitation." As they followed Alexandru out of the ballroom, Elena's mind whirled with the events of the day. She had come to the castle expecting to plead for her people, only to find herself at the center of a seismic shift in Transylvanian politics. And through it all, she couldn't shake the memory of the warmth in Alexandru's eyes when he looked at her, or the way her heart raced whenever they spoke. The sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple. In the fading light, Castle Vlaicu seemed transformed, no longer a symbol of oppression but a beacon of hope for a new future. As Elena walked beside her father and the Duke, she felt a sense of possibility she had never known before. But even as hope blossomed, shadows lurked at the edges of her vision. Not everyone would welcome these changes, and the path ahead was fraught with danger. Elena knew that the real challenges were only just beginning, and that the fate of Transylvania would rest on the shoulders of those willing to fight for a better tomorrow. As they entered the intimate dining room, the air thick with the aroma of roasted meats and freshly baked bread, Elena steeled herself for what promised to be a night of intense discussion and potentially world-altering decisions. Whatever happened, she was determined to play her part in shaping the future of the land she loved. The intimate dining room of Castle Vlaicu was a stark contrast to the grand ballroom they had just left. Warm candlelight flickered across the rich tapestries adorning the walls, casting a soft glow over the ornate table set for three. Duke Alexandru led Elena and her father Radu to their seats, a servant quietly pulling out their chairs. As they settled in, the air was thick with unspoken tension. Radu's eyes darted warily around the room, while Elena found herself unable to look directly at Alexandru, her mind still reeling from the revelations of the day. Alexandru cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "I want to thank you both for accepting my invitation. I know this situation is unconventional, to say the least." Radu's voice was gruff as he responded, "Unconventional is putting it mildly, Your Grace. You'll forgive me if I find it difficult to trust a man who has been deceiving us." Elena winced at her father's bluntness, but Alexandru merely nodded, his expression somber. "Your skepticism is understandable, and I take full responsibility for my deception. It was never my intention to cause harm or sow distrust. I only sought to understand the true concerns of my people, unfiltered by the usual barriers of rank and protocol." A servant appeared, pouring rich red wine into their goblets. Elena took a small sip, grateful for the momentary distraction. "And what did you learn from this masquerade, Your Grace?" Radu pressed, his tone softening slightly but still edged with suspicion. Alexandru's gaze moved between father and daughter as he answered, "I learned that the divide between nobility and common folk is far wider than I had realized. I saw firsthand the struggles that my policies have inadvertently caused. But more than that, I discovered a resilience and wisdom among the villagers that put many of my advisors to shame." His eyes lingered on Elena as he spoke, causing a blush to rise to her cheeks. She found her voice at last, asking, "But why go to such lengths? Surely there were other ways to gather this information." Alexandru leaned forward, his blue eyes intense. "Perhaps, but none that would have given me the unvarnished truth. Elena, when we met in the forest, when you showed me around the village, those moments were genuine. They showed me a Transylvania I had never truly seen before, one full of potential and hope." The first course arrived, a delicate soup that steamed invitingly. As they began to eat, Radu spoke again, his voice thoughtful. "Your proposed reforms are ambitious, Your Grace. Some might say dangerously so. How can you be certain the nobility will accept such sweeping changes?" Alexandru set down his spoon, his expression grave. "I can't be certain, to be frank. There will be resistance, perhaps even attempts to undermine these efforts, but I believe that the future of Transylvania depends on bridging this divide. The alternative is a slow descent into chaos and rebellion, which would destroy everything we hold dear." Elena found herself nodding in agreement. "It's a risk, certainly, but one worth taking. The people are at a breaking point, Father. If we don't seize this opportunity for change, I fear what might happen." Radu studied his daughter, a mix of pride and concern in his eyes. You've grown wise beyond your years, Elena. Perhaps it's time I started listening to you more. He turned back to Alexandru. Very well, Your Grace. You have my cautious support. But know this. If these reforms prove to be empty promises, the consequences will be severe. Alexandru met Radu's gaze steadily. I would expect nothing less. Your dedication to your people is admirable, and it's precisely that spirit of protection and justice that I hope to foster throughout Transylvania. As the main course was served, a succulent roast with herbs that filled the room with its aroma, the conversation shifted to more practical matters. They discussed the details of implementing the reforms, the potential challenges they might face, and strategies for gaining wider support among both nobles and villagers. Elena found herself increasingly engaged, offering insights from her experiences in the village and suggesting ways to communicate the changes effectively to the common folk. Alexandru listened intently, often building upon her ideas with his own. As the meal progressed, Elena couldn't help but notice the way Alexandru's eyes would seek hers, the warmth in his gaze when she spoke. Despite her lingering hurt over his deception, she felt drawn to him, to his vision for a better Transylvania. As dessert was served, a delicate pastry filled with local berries, Alexandru turned the conversation to a more personal note. I owe you both an apology, he said softly. Especially you, Elena. I never intended for my disguise to complicate matters as it has. Elena met his gaze, her heart racing. I understand why you did it, Your Grace, but I won't pretend it didn't hurt to discover the truth. Alexandru reached across the table, his hand stopping just short of hers. I give you my word, from this moment forward, there will be no more deception between us. I value your insight, your compassion, and your courage far too much to risk losing your trust again. The intensity of his words hung in the air between them. Radu cleared his throat, breaking the moment. Fine words, Your Grace, but actions will speak louder in the days to come. Alexandru nodded, withdrawing his hand. Indeed they will, which is why I have a proposal for you both. He took a deep breath before continuing. I would like to appoint Elena as a special advisor to the crown, specifically tasked with overseeing the implementation of these reforms and acting as a liaison between the nobility and the villages. Elena gasped, her eyes wide with shock. Me? But I have no experience in such matters. On the contrary, Alexandru countered, you have the most vital experience of all. You understand both worlds, Elena. You have the trust of your people and the intelligence to navigate the complexities of court politics. With your father's guidance and your own innate wisdom, I believe you could play a crucial role in shaping Transylvania's future. Radu sat back in his chair, his expression unreadable. It's a great honor you offer, Your Grace, but also a great burden. Elena, my dear, the choice must be yours. Elena's mind raced. The magnitude of what Alexandru was proposing overwhelmed her, and yet beneath the fear and uncertainty, she felt a spark of excitement, of possibility. She thought of her village, of all the villages across Transylvania, and the chance to make a real difference in their lives. I would be honored to accept, Your Grace, she said finally, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. If you truly believe I can help, then I will do everything in my power to see these reforms succeed. Alexandru's face lit up with a smile that made Elena's heart skip a beat. I have no doubt that you will excel, Elena. Your courage and compassion are exactly what Transylvania needs in these changing times. As the evening drew to a close, Elena found herself standing on a balcony overlooking the castle grounds. The cool night air, a welcome respite after the intensity of the day's events. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Alexandru approaching. May I join you? He asked softly. At her nod, he came to stand beside her, their shoulders nearly touching as they gazed out at the moonlit landscape. Are you having second thoughts? Alexandru asked after a moment of comfortable silence. Elena shook her head. No, not second thoughts. But I'd be lying if I said I wasn't afraid. This is all so much bigger than anything I ever imagined for myself. Alexandru turned to face her, his expression earnest. Elena, I meant what I said earlier. I have complete faith in you, your strength, your wisdom. They're exactly what Transylvania needs, what I need. The weight of his words, the intensity of his gaze made Elena's breath catch in her throat. She found herself leaning towards him almost involuntarily, but before the moment could progress, a discreet cough from the doorway interrupted them. They turned to see Radu standing there, his expression a mixture of concern and resignation. It's late, he said simply. We should retire. Tomorrow brings new challenges. As Elena bid Alexandru good night and followed her father to their guest chambers, her mind whirled with the possibilities and dangers that lay ahead. She knew that the path they had chosen would not be easy, that there would be opposition and obstacles at every turn. But as she drifted off to sleep in the unfamiliar grandeur of the castle, Elena felt a sense of purpose she had never known before. Whatever trials awaited them, she was determined to face them head-on, for the sake of her people, for Transylvania, and for the future she and Alexandru dared to imagine together. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the castle courtyard as Elena made her way to the stables. She had risen before dawn, her mind too full of the previous day's events to allow for restful sleep. As she approached, she heard the soft nickering of horses and the rhythmic sound of brushing. To her surprise, she found Alexandru already there, tending to his magnificent black stallion. He looked up as she entered, a warm smile spreading across his face. Good morning, Elena. I didn't expect to find anyone else awake at this hour. Elena returned his smile, though she felt a flutter of nervousness in her stomach. I couldn't sleep, she admitted. There's so much to think about, so much to plan. Alexandru nodded in understanding. I know the feeling well. Sometimes I find that the company of horses helps to clear my mind. Would you care to join me for a ride? There's something I'd like to show you. Elena hesitated for a moment, then nodded. I'd like that, Your Grace. Please, he said softly, when we're alone, call me Alexandru. After all we've been through, I think we've moved beyond such formalities. As they prepared their horses, Elena couldn't help but marvel at how different Alexandru seemed here in the stables, away from the pomp and ceremony of court. His movements were sure and gentle as he saddled his horse, and there was a contentment in his expression that she hadn't seen before. Once they were mounted, Alexandru led them out of the castle gates and onto a winding trail that climbed into the nearby hills. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the steady clip-clop of hooves and the occasional call of a bird. Finally, Alexandru spoke. Elena, I wanted to thank you again for accepting the position of advisor. I know it's a tremendous responsibility, and I'm grateful for your willingness to take it on. Elena took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts before responding. I'm honored by your trust in me, Alexandru, but I have to ask, why me? Surely there are others with more experience, more knowledge of politics and governance. Alexandru reined in his horse, turning to face her fully. His blue eyes were intense as he spoke. Experience can be gained, Elena. Knowledge can be taught. But the qualities that truly matter, compassion, integrity, the ability to see beyond class and status, those are rare and precious. You possess them in abundance. Elena felt a blush creeping up her cheeks at his words. You give me too much credit, she said softly. On the contrary, Alexandru replied, I don't think I give you enough. He paused, seeming to wrestle with his next words. Elena, I've never met anyone quite like you. Your strength, your wisdom, your love for Transylvania, they inspire me to be a better ruler, a better man. The weight of his words hung in the air between them. Elena's heart raced, and she found herself at a loss for how to respond. Before she could gather her thoughts, Alexandru urged his horse forward again. Come, he said, his voice lighter now. We're almost there. They crested a hill, and Elena gasped at the view that spread out before them. The entire valley lay bathed in the golden light of dawn, mist curling around the bases of distant mountains. Villages dotted the landscape, their church spires reaching skyward, while vast forests and fields stretched as far as the eye could see. "This is why I come here," Alexandru said quietly. "To remind myself of what we're fighting for. All of this, Elena, the villages, the forests, the people, it's our responsibility to protect and nurture it." Elena nodded, her eyes drinking in the breathtaking vista. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "I've never seen Transylvania like this before." Alexandru turned to her, his expression serious. "This is what I want you to help me preserve and improve, Elena. Not just the land, but the lives of every person who calls Transylvania home. It won't be easy. There will be resistance, perhaps even danger. Are you truly prepared for what lies ahead?" Elena met his gaze steadily. "I am," she said, her voice firm. "Whatever challenges we face, I believe in what we're trying to achieve. A Transylvania where everyone has a voice, where prosperity is shared, where old grudges can finally heal." Alexandru's face broke into a smile that made Elena's heart skip a beat. "Then we'll face those challenges together," he said softly. As they sat there, overlooking the awakening land, Elena felt a surge of emotions. Hope, determination, and something else, something warmer that she wasn't quite ready to name. She knew that the path ahead would be difficult, but in that moment, with Alexandru by her side and the promise of a better future spread out before them, she felt ready to take on whatever lay ahead. Their peaceful moment was interrupted by the distant sound of hoofbeats. Alexandru tensed, his hand moving instinctively to the hilt of his sword. As they watched, a rider came into view, pushing his horse hard up the hill towards them. "Your Grace," the man called out as he approached. Elena recognized him as one of the castle guards. "Forgive the interruption, but there's urgent news. A group of nobles has arrived at the castle demanding an audience. They're threatening to withdraw their support for the reforms." Alexandru's expression hardened, the carefree man of moments ago replaced by the stern duke. "I see," he said, his voice tight. "We'll return at once." He turned to Elena, apology in his eyes. "I'm sorry our ride has been cut short." Elena shook her head. "Don't apologize. This is the reality of what we've undertaken. We knew there would be opposition." As they rode back to the castle, far faster than their leisurely pace earlier, Elena's mind raced. The idyllic morning had been shattered, bringing them abruptly back to the harsh realities of politics and power. But rather than fear, she felt a steely determination settling over her. "Alexandru," she said as they approached the castle gates, "let me speak with them." He looked at her in surprise. "Elena, these nobles can be ruthless. Are you sure?" She nodded firmly. "They need to see that these reforms aren't just your idea, that they have support from the people. Let me be the bridge we talked about." Alexandru studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Very well, but I'll be right there with you." As they dismounted in the courtyard, Elena took a deep breath, steadying herself. She thought of the villagers back home, of her father and his lifelong struggle for justice. She thought of the breathtaking view from the hilltop, of all that was at stake. "Ready?" Alexandru asked softly, offering his arm. Elena took it, feeling the strength in his touch. "Ready," she replied. Together they walked into the castle, prepared to face whatever challenges awaited them. As they entered the great hall, Elena felt a sense of destiny settling over her. This was where she was meant to be, fighting for her people, for Transylvania, and for a future brighter than any she had dared to imagine. The doors swung open, revealing a group of stern-faced nobles. Elena felt Alexandru's arm tense beneath her hand, but she stood tall, her chin held high. Whatever happened next, she knew that their fight for a better Transylvania had only just begun. The great hall of Castle Vlaicu echoed with tense voices as Elena and Alexandru faced the assembled nobles. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, illuminating the dust motes that swirled in the air, charged with the electricity of impending conflict. Lord Dragos, his face flushed with indignation, stepped forward. "Your Grace," he began, his voice dripping with barely concealed contempt, "we have come to express our grave concerns about these so-called reforms you propose. They threaten the very fabric of our society." Elena felt Alexandru stiffen beside her, but his voice remained calm as he responded. Lord Dragos, gentlemen, I appreciate your coming to discuss this matter. However, I believe you're acting on incomplete information. Perhaps if we... Incomplete information? Lady Margareta, a sharp-featured woman with steely gray hair, interrupted. What we know is that you intend to upend centuries of tradition to give peasants a voice in matters they cannot possibly understand. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the group of nobles. Elena took a deep breath, steeling herself before speaking. My lords and ladies, if I may. All eyes turned to her, some curious, others dismissive. My name is Elena. I am one of those peasants you speak of, and also an advisor to His Grace on these reforms. Lord Dragos scoffed. And what qualifications does a village girl have to advise on matters of state? Elena met his gaze steadily. I have lived the realities that these reforms seek to address. I have seen families struggle under the weight of unjust taxes, watched as ancestral lands were seized on the whims of distant nobles. But I have also seen the strength, wisdom, and potential that exists in every village across Transylvania. She paused, looking each noble in the eye before continuing. These reforms are not about destroying tradition. They're about building a stronger Transylvania, one where every citizen has a stake in our shared prosperity. Alexandru stepped forward, placing a supportive hand on Elena's shoulder. Elena speaks the truth. What we propose is not revolution but evolution. A Transylvania that adapts to the changing world around us, that harnesses the full potential of all its people. Lady Ilona, who had remained silent until now, spoke up. Your Grace, while I admire your idealism, we must consider the practical implications. How can we be sure these changes won't lead to chaos? Elena saw an opening and seized it. My lady, if I may suggest, perhaps we could implement these reforms in stages. Begin with a few key changes, closely monitored, and adjust as needed. This would allow us to address your concerns while still moving forward. Alexandru nodded, building on Elena's idea. An excellent suggestion. We could form a joint committee, with representatives from both the nobility and the villages, to oversee the implementation and report on the results. A thoughtful silence fell over the room as the nobles considered this proposal. Lord Dragos, however, was not so easily swayed. And what of our rights? Our privileges? Are we to simply hand them over to the rabble? Elena felt a flash of anger at his words, but forced herself to remain calm. My lord, these reforms do not seek to strip you of your rights, but to extend similar protections to all Transylvanians. A stable, prosperous peasantry means greater wealth and security for everyone, nobles included. Alexandru stepped in, his voice firm. Lord Dragos, I understand your concerns. Change is never easy. But I ask you to consider the alternative. The unrest in our villages grows by the day. If we do not address these issues now, we risk facing a true rebellion that could tear Transylvania apart. Lady Margareta, who had been listening intently, spoke up. Your Grace, you speak of unrest. How severe is the situation truly? Elena saw her chance. My lady, if I may, in my village alone, we've seen increased talk of rebellion. People are desperate, feeling they have no other recourse. These reforms offer a peaceful alternative, a way to address grievances without resorting to violence. The atmosphere in the room shifted as the nobles digested this information. Lady Ilona turned to Alexandru. Your Grace, perhaps we have been too hasty in our judgment. I, for one, would be interested in hearing more about this staged implementation plan. Over the next few hours, Elena found herself at the center of intense negotiations. She drew on everything she had learned from her father and her experiences in the village, explaining the realities of peasant life to nobles who had never set foot outside their estates. Alexandru supported her at every turn, his presence a steady anchor amid the storm of debate. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the great hall, a tentative agreement was reached. The reforms would be implemented gradually, with close monitoring and regular reviews. A joint committee would be formed to oversee the process, with equal representation from nobility and villages. Lord Dragos and a few others still grumbled, but the majority of the nobles seemed cautiously supportive of the plan. As the meeting adjourned, Elena felt a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. They had taken the first crucial step towards realizing their vision for a new Transylvania. Alexandru turned to her, his blue eyes shining with pride and something deeper that made Elena's heart race. "You were magnificent," he said softly. "I couldn't have done this without you." Before Elena could respond, her father appeared at her side. Radu's face was a mask of conflicting emotions, pride, concern, and a hint of resignation. "You've done well, daughter," he said gruffly. "Your mother would be proud." Tears pricked at Elena's eyes at the mention of her mother. "Thank you, father," she whispered. As the nobles filed out, Alexandru addressed the remaining advisors. "We have much work ahead of us. Let's reconvene in the morning to begin drafting the detailed plans." With that, the gathering dispersed. Elena found herself walking alongside Alexandru through the castle corridors, their footsteps echoing in the quiet. "How are you feeling?" Alexandru asked gently. Elena took a moment to gather her thoughts. "Overwhelmed," she admitted. "Excited. Terrified. I never imagined I'd be part of something like this." Alexandru stopped, turning to face her fully. "Elena, what you did today, it was extraordinary. You bridged a gap that has existed for centuries. You gave voice to those who have long been silenced." She blushed under the intensity of his gaze. "I only spoke the truth, Alexandru. The truth of what I've seen and lived. And that truth has the power to change everything," he said softly. He hesitated for a moment, then reached out to take her hand. "Elena, I need you to know how much your presence here means to me, not just for Transylvania, but personally." Elena's heart thundered in her chest. She looked up into Alexandru's eyes, seeing the warmth and vulnerability there. "Alexandru, But before she could finish, a servant rounded the corner, stopping short at the sight of them. "Your Grace, forgive the interruption. An urgent message has arrived from the eastern border." Alexandru sighed, reluctantly releasing Elena's hand. "Duty calls, it seems. We'll continue this conversation later." Elena nodded, trying to quell the disappointment rising in her chest. "Of course. Good night, Alexandru." As she watched him walk away, Elena felt a whirlwind of emotions. The day's events, the weight of their accomplishments, and the unspoken feelings between her and Alexandru all swirled together in a dizzying mix. She made her way to her chambers, her mind racing with plans and possibilities. As she prepared for bed, Elena realized that her life had irrevocably changed. She was no longer just a village girl with dreams of a better world. She was now an active participant in shaping Transylvania's future. The path ahead would be challenging, filled with obstacles and opposition. But as Elena drifted off to sleep, she felt a sense of purpose and hope that she had never known before. Whatever trials awaited them, she was ready to face them. For her people, for Transylvania, and for the future she and Alexandru dared to imagine together. The autumn sun cast a golden glow over the Transylvanian countryside as Elena stood on the balcony of Castle Vlaicu, her eyes scanning the horizon. 6 months had passed since that fateful meeting with the nobles, and the landscape before her seemed to mirror the changes sweeping through the land. Fields that had once lain fallow now burst with crops, tended by farmers who worked with renewed vigor. In the distance, she could see the framework of a new school rising in a nearby village, one of many projects born from the reforms she and Alexandru had championed. "Quite a view, isn't it?" Alexandru's voice came from behind her, warm and familiar. She turned to find him smiling, his blue eyes twinkling with the same passion that had driven them through countless meetings, negotiations, and late-night planning sessions. "It's beautiful," Elena replied, returning his smile. "Sometimes I can hardly believe how much has changed in such a short time." Alexandru moved to stand beside her, their shoulders nearly touching. "We've made remarkable progress," he agreed, "but we both know there's still much work to be done." Elena nodded, her expression growing serious. "The eastern provinces are still resisting some of the changes, and there are rumors of nobles secretly plotting to undermine our efforts." "Which is precisely why I wanted to speak with you," Alexandru said, turning to face her fully. "Elena, I'm planning a tour of the eastern regions. I want to see the situation for myself, to speak directly with the people there. And I want you to come with me." Elena's heart skipped a beat. The idea of traveling with Alexandru, of working side by side in the field, both thrilled and terrified her. "Of course," she said without hesitation. "When do we leave?" "In 3 days," Alexandru replied. "It will be a challenging journey. We'll be away from the castle for at least a month, possibly longer. Are you sure you're prepared for this?" Elena met his gaze steadily. "I am. This is what we've been working towards, Alexandru. The chance to truly connect with the people, to show them that these reforms are more than just words on paper." Alexandru's face broke into a radiant smile. "I knew you'd say that. Your dedication, your passion for our people, it never ceases to amaze me." There was a moment of charged silence between them, filled with all the unspoken feelings that had been building over the past months. Elena felt her cheeks flush under the intensity of Alexandru's gaze. Before either of them could speak, however, the door to the balcony burst open. Mihai, Alexandru's trusted advisor, rushed in, his face pale with urgency. "Your Grace, my lady," he panted. "Forgive the interruption, but we've received dire news. There's been an attack on one of the Reform Committee members in the eastern province of Bistrița." Alexandru's expression hardened instantly. "What happened? Who was attacked?" Mihai took a deep breath. "It was Lord Vasile, Your Grace. He was ambushed while traveling to oversee the implementation of the new tax reforms. He's alive but severely wounded." Elena gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Lord Vasile had been one of their strongest supporters among the nobility, a voice of reason in many heated debates. Alexandru's voice was tight with controlled anger as he spoke. "This changes things. We can no longer afford to wait. Mihai, make preparations for our departure immediately. We leave for Bistrița at first light tomorrow." As Mihai hurried off to carry out the orders, Alexandru turned back to Elena. "I understand if this changes your mind about accompanying me. The situation is clearly more dangerous than we anticipated." Elena straightened her shoulders, meeting his concerned gaze with determination. "All the more reason for me to go with you. The people need to see that we stand united, that we won't be intimidated by those who oppose progress." Alexandru reached out, taking her hand in his. "Elena, your bravery never ceases to humble me, but I need you to understand the risks. Whoever is behind this attack, they won't hesitate to target you as well." "I know the risks," Elena said softly, squeezing his hand, "and I accept them. We started this journey together, Alexandru. We'll see it through together." The intensity of the moment was palpable, the air between them charged with emotion. Alexandru took a step closer, his free hand rising to cup Elena's cheek. "Elena, But once again, fate intervened. The sound of running footsteps approached, and they quickly stepped apart as Radu, Elena's father, burst onto the balcony. "Elena, I've just heard the news," he said, his voice gruff with concern. "You can't seriously be considering going on this trip now." Elena took a deep breath, steeling herself for the argument she knew was coming. "Father, I have to go. This is too important to abandon now." Radu's face darkened. "Important? More important than your safety? Elena, be reasonable." Alexandru stepped forward, his voice calm but authoritative. "Radu, I give you my word that Elena will be under the highest protection. My personal guard will accompany us, and will take every precaution necessary." Radu looked between them, his expression a mixture of frustration and resignation. "And I suppose there's nothing I can say to change either of your minds?" Elena moved to her father, taking his weathered hands in hers. "Father, do you remember what you always told me? That change requires courage, that we must be willing to risk everything for what we believe in." Radu's stern expression softened slightly. "I never imagined those words would come back to haunt me like this," he said with a rueful smile. "I learned from the best," Elena replied, embracing him tightly. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the balcony, the three of them stood in contemplative silence. The weight of what lay ahead hung heavy in the air, but there was also a sense of purpose, of destiny unfolding. Alexandru was the first to break the silence. We should begin our preparations. There's much to be done before dawn. As they made their way back into the castle, Elena felt a complex mix of emotions swirling within her. Fear of the unknown dangers that awaited them, determination to see their vision for Transylvania realized, and something else, a warmth that spread through her chest whenever Alexandru was near. That night, as Elena packed for the journey ahead, she paused by the window of her chamber. The moon hung low and full over the Transylvanian landscape, bathing everything in silvery light. She thought of how far they had come, of the challenges they had already overcome, and of the uncertain path that lay before them. But as she gazed out at the land she loved, Elena felt a surge of resolve. Whatever trials awaited them in the east, whatever forces sought to undermine their work, she knew that together with Alexandru, they could face anything. With a deep breath, she turned back to her preparations, ready to embrace whatever the dawn might bring. The journey ahead would be perilous, but it was a journey towards the future they had dreamed of, a future of justice, equality, and hope for all of Transylvania. As the castle settled into the quiet of night, two hearts beat with shared purpose and unspoken longing, each aware that the coming days would test not only their resolve, but the depths of their feelings for one another. The stage was set for a journey that would change not just Transylvania, but their lives forever.